Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part one of the Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture, Why the Study of Arab Americans Advances Aging Research and Practice. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You should see the first one pop up right now. So just let us know who you are, and you can elaborate on that in the chat as well. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat throughout today's presentation. We do also encourage participation in the chat. We're going to wait just another moment or two before we get started, so sit tight and remember to respond to the polls.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beth Angel, and I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2023 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture. This year's lecture will take place over a 2-day period. Today is part one, and in a moment, Professor Kristine Ajrouch will discuss why the study of Arab Americans advances aging research and practice. Tomorrow, Professor Peter Lichtenberg will speak about financial exploitation. Now, before we begin, I want to share with you some of this lecture series history. Josephine Winkelman was a 1919 graduate of the University of Michigan's social work program. She worked at Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago. Her husband, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman's Stores in Detroit with his brother Isidore in 1928. Their son, Stanley, was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit and deeply involved in social justice issues in the city. In 1978, the Leon and Josephine Memorial Lecture was created here at the school through an endowed gift from Stanley and his brothers as a tribute to their parents. The lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and helping professions in the field of gerontology. The lecture also provides an opportunity to discuss the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services, and the delivery of social work services. We're so grateful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides an opportunity to honor our alumna, Josephine Winkelman, and her husband, Leon. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Robert Joseph Taylor, who will serve as our moderator today. Robert is the Harold R. Johnson Endowed Professor of Social Work and the Sheila Feld Collegiate Professor of Social Work. Dr. Taylor is an esteemed and influential researcher who has published extensively on the informal social support networks, including family, friends, and church members of adult and elderly Black Americans. He has been a co-principal investigator on several National Institute of Mental Health grants on the correlation of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans. Dr. Taylor's influence goes beyond research. His leadership has greatly impacted and encouraged a generation of social work scholars. He's the principal investigator of the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research and the director of the Program for Research on Black Americans. Those two programs host a summer mentoring workshop, which Robert has directed since its inception in 1998. Finally, in 2021, Dr. Taylor received the inaugural James Jackson Outstanding Mentorship Award from the Gerontological Society of America. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Robert Joseph Taylor. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Dean Angel. I would like to introduce Dr. Kristine Ajrouch. She is a professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan, and she is also a research professor here at the University of Michigan at the Institute for Social Research. She co-directs the Michigan Center for Contextual Factors in Alzheimer's Disease, and her work, spanning over 25 years, has focused on Middle Eastern Arab Americans. Her current research is funded by grants from the National Institute of Aging. She has published in many high-impact journals. Many of her papers I have cited in the past. She has been working with other scholars and consulting with them for the census, with whom she has worked on the feasibility of including Middle East, North African as a separate category. Her research addresses both Arab American, Asian Arab Americans, and contextual aspects of Alzheimer's disease. Please welcome Dr. Ajrouch.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for that wonderful introduction. It is a pleasure to be here today. I am really excited to be here at the School of Social Work. And like to thank Dr. Taylor and the School of Social Work for asking me to be part of this distinguished series of the Winkelman Memorial Lectures. I want to say it's especially meaningful for me to be asked to be part of this series to talk on the topic of Arab American aging, because my program of research on this topic was initiated by a postdoctoral fellowship through the University School of Social Work over 20 years ago. And I just want to observe that that was quite a bold and courageous acknowledgement on the part of the School of Social Work to recognize Arab American aging as important to the field. This happened well before this group was widely recognized as an appropriate focus of scholarly study. What I hope to do today is to make the case for the importance, benefits, advantages, and strengths that come with making Arab Americans visible in aging research and practice. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what I hope to cover today. I'm going to begin by defining who are Arab Americans. This is especially important as this group has been immigrating to the United States for over 100 years, but until September of 2001 was virtually invisible. Following 9/11 in 2001, they have, however, become hypervisible, but generally in a negative way. This will be followed by a brief discussion of how a focus on within-group heterogeneity provides new insights into inequalities and population aging. And next, I will discuss a series of findings that show how a focus on Arab Americans illuminates new directions in the study of disparities. I will then turn to some findings related to recently completed studies focusing on older Arab Americans in the Metro Detroit area on the topic of COVID-19 stress and cognitive health, including results from an Alzheimer's disease caregiver intervention project to illustrate how a focus on Arab Americans can really advance aging research and practice. You'll see throughout my presentation that I present a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, as each methodology illuminates key aspects of aging and both inform the other. Finally, I will showcase how the Arab American case furthers our understanding of the immigrant paradox, a concept in the literature that is especially key for understanding immigrant aging. So although the term may be familiar to many of you, let me start by defining Arab Americans and also what is emerging as quite prevalent in everyday language as well as scholarly work, the MENA term. Defining racial ethnic groups is always a challenge because it asks us to indicate boundaries. What makes somebody white? What makes somebody Black? What makes them Hispanic? Or what makes them Arab? Social scientists understand that these categories are socially constructed. They're not a biological fact, but nevertheless a powerful social fact. The definition that I have used in my research on Arab Americans is that it refers to anyone with ancestry to an Arabic-speaking country. In this way, it mirrors the definition of Hispanics, it is language-based, and it's a pan-ethnic categorization that includes people from 22 different countries, various religions, including Muslims and Christians, as well as an array of ethnicities that have long lived in Arabic-speaking countries, including Chaldeans and Kurds. Arab American, then, is a term that encompasses individuals who trace their ancestries to a diverse number of national origins, ethnic groups, and religious affiliations. Now, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, legally classifies Arab Americans as simply white. There's growing evidence, however, to suggest that Arab American experiences do not mirror overall white experiences, suggesting that the study of Arab Americans may provide unique insights into theoretical and practical initiatives. So I will, throughout this presentation, use Arab Americans and the term MENA, which is short for Middle Eastern and North African, interchangeably. MENA is an emerging category poised to be included in the next US Census. And for those of you who are paying attention, the OMB has been requesting comments on the on the initial proposals from the Working Group on Race and Ethnicity Standards for revising the 1997 Statistical Policy Directive that actually tells us what racial and ethnic categories are legally recognized. They're actually accepting comment through, I think, the middle of April. So it's an exciting time because the census is proposing to include MENA in the 2030 census. And this label is a bit broader than Arab American, as it includes non-Arab countries, including Turkey, Israel, and Iran. So making this transition in nomenclature will be key as research on this population increases. So, as I said, Arab Americans have been present in the United States for over 100 years. Before 1965, which is when immigration opened again, immigrants from Arabic-speaking countries had narratives that mirrored European migrant stories, and they primarily hailed from the countries of Syria and Lebanon. Now, in 1924, when immigration effectively came to a halt, migration from these countries also stopped, just like it did from European countries. In 1965, when the laws changed and immigration started to open again, contrary to their European counterparts, immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa started immigrating again, but they started immigrating because of turmoil and political instabilities. Furthermore, the regions that they came from expanded to include Egypt, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq, beyond the Syrian and Lebanese who were still coming during this time. In particular, Southeast Michigan is home to the largest, most visible concentration of Arab Americans in the nation. They have a lengthy history here, being drawn initially by the auto industry. In 1990, they only made up 0.8% of the Michigan population, but you can see that 30 years later, their presence in Michigan has tripled to make up 3% of the entire population of Michigan. And so because there was an existing and vibrant community here, recent immigrants who enter the country actually voluntarily pick up and leave and come to Michigan because there's an established community infrastructure. Okay, so I'm going to pause right here because I know we have some questions for our CE folks. And it's a true and false question. Okay, all right. And almost all of you got it correct. That is right. MENA Arab Americans are currently considered white. That is true. Okay, so although Arab Americans have had a long history in the US, and there's been increasing immigration, they have, for the most part, been invisible in aging research, even though this is a rapidly aging population. So in the American Community Survey, which, by the way, is part of the US Census, and one of the only ways that we can possibly identify Arab Americans because of the ancestry question, it suggests that 11% of all Arab Americans age 60 and over in Metro Detroit, 11% are age 60 and over in Metro Detroit. Because most nationally representative data classifies MENA as white, as required by OMB, research on Arab Americans at the national level is limited. And we can identify them, as I said, in the census, through the ancestry question, through the National Health Interview Survey. They can also be identified, but only the immigrant population. So people who say they're not born in the US, but they're born in one of the Arab countries, then they can be identified that way as a group. And this requires, of course, researchers to be innovative. As a matter of fact, when I first started my postdoctoral fellowship here at the School of Social Work, my charge was to go engage in secondary data analysis. And when I went to the secondary data sets, I realized there were no Arab Americans there because there was no identifier for them. So I had to be a little bit creative. So community studies oftentimes work with community organizations in order to identify samples of Arab Americans. But of course, the shortcoming here is that they lack generalizability to the larger population. So we know that markers of inequality are of prime concern in the study of aging, especially those related to socioeconomic status. So using American Community Survey data, and again, the ancestry question, we're able to provide a portrait of socioeconomic status among MENA Americans, and in particular, to highlight the heterogeneity of this population. So what I want to point out here is that at the national level, the MENA population appears to be highly educated, and you can see this blue bar, almost 45% of the MENA population say they have a college or more degree, which is more than non-Hispanic whites. However, and they also have relatively low unemployment rates, and approximately 32% are living in poverty, slightly less than whites. However, what I also want to point your attention to is that 13% of all Arab Americans at the national level are also in the category of having less than a high school education. And this proportion is more than non-Hispanic whites as well. What this does is suggest a bifurcation of the population, with a large segment seemingly doing quite well, but clear pockets of vulnerability. When we look at the MENA population in Metro Detroit and compare them to the national population of MENA population, we see a distinct pattern of vulnerability in Metro Detroit. In Metro Detroit, MENA are much more likely than the national sample to report having less than a high school education. They're also less likely to report having a college education, and there's a larger proportion of them who report that they're living in poverty. And then just to compare MENAs to Blacks and whites in Metro Detroit, you can see here that MENA report the highest percentage of those with less than a high school education. The bifurcation of the population in terms of socioeconomic status is particularly noteworthy, given that almost the same proportion of those who report having less than a high school education also report having a college education. So it's almost evenly split down the middle. Arabs and Blacks are also more disadvantaged than whites in terms of living in poverty. You can see here about 44% of the MENA in Metro Detroit are living in poverty, similar to Blacks at 41%, and whites are at about 15%. So the takeaway message here that I'd like to give is that MENA patterns of socioeconomic status are not similar to whites, even though they're legally considered white. Further, even within the same region, there's heterogeneity of MENA in the Detroit area. The Wayne County area, which is where we traditionally think of finding the MENA population, is also often home to the largest number and largest concentration, but is overall rather young, as you can see with this pyramid-shaped population grid. Both Macomb and Oakland counties, where we also have sizable populations of MENA individuals, are relatively older and appear to be aging at a faster rate than Wayne County. And you can see that evidenced by the more rectangular shapes in these population pyramids. And the reason why I bring this up is because if we were to judge the MENA population in Michigan by only looking in Wayne County, which is home to Dearborn, where we usually think of as the city that houses Arab Americans, we would assume that aging is rather minimal, when in reality, it's more complicated than that. So population aging leads to the interesting concern that I've developed over the last several years in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, given that older age is the largest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And so an area of growing concern when it comes to aging populations is that of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. Though Alzheimer's prevalence is unknown for the MENA population, there have been recent papers investigating the prevalence of cognitive limitations among the MENA population in comparative perspective. And here it's my pleasure to highlight a paper that was recently published by a research scientist funded by our AD Rickmar McFadden. Flora Dallow and Tiffany Kindred both took an innovative approach to documenting why MENA may be at high risk for Alzheimer's. So using the National Health Interview Survey, where MENA immigrants can be separated from the non-Hispanic white population, this paper investigated what proportion of those age 45 and older answered yes to one of two questions, whether any family member is limited by difficulty remembering or because of periods of confusion, or whether senility, dementia, or Alzheimer's causes them difficulty with activities. And here you can see that adjusting for age and gender, foreign-born Arab Americans, that's the bar on the very right, they're labeled MENA here, reported a higher percentage at 10% than US-born and foreign-born whites in terms of saying yes to either one of those questions. And I also want to point out that this paper reported that MENA immigrants are 1.5 times more likely to report having these indicators of Alzheimer's compared to US-born non-Hispanic whites. So with the goal of advancing the science of cognitive health disparities, our team in the Life Course Development Program at the Institute for Social Research have initiated the Detroit Area Wellness Network, or DAWN projects. These are 2 new data collection projects about to launch in spring of this year. It was delayed due to COVID-19, and we refer to them as the Detroit Aging and Memory Project and the Social Relations Study. I'm going to focus my attention on telling you about the Detroit Aging and Memory Project, which we call DAMP for short. Because the study was halted, we actually applied for a supplement to study COVID stress and cognitive health among the MENA population compared to Blacks and whites in the same Metro Detroit area. And throughout the pandemic, it was really frustrating to really know what COVID was doing to the MENA population, because as mentioned earlier, they are not separated out from whites in any statistics. So we never really knew research-wise or statistically what was happening with the MENA population. But recently, Flora Dallow and Tiffany Kindred with other colleagues using a name algorithm actually was able to identify what was happening with regards to COVID. And essentially what they found was that the MENA population was more than 2.5 times more likely to have tested positive for COVID-19 compared to non-Hispanic whites. And that's true in every age group. So the younger adults, 18 to 39, 40 to 59, 60 to 79, and even 80 plus. So we're beginning to see that there are some disparities when it comes to COVID around the MENA population. So our data, which actually sought to measure stress from COVID-19 as well as cognitive health, was also able to show clear disparities in COVID-19 stress. And we focused only among adults age 65 and older. And here what you can see from the graph is that both MENA and Blacks reported higher levels of stress. Blacks and MENA reporting more economic stress than whites, but interestingly, MENA also were more likely to report more lost income than Blacks. In other words, a higher proportion of MENA reported that they were losing income, and that was greater than what Blacks in our study reported. MENA were also twice as likely to report COVID symptoms and just as likely as Blacks to know someone who dies from COVID. Now, in this next slide, what I want to show you is what happens if we just didn't screen for MENA and just considered them to be white as they are legally speaking. When I say legally speaking, I mean according to the racial and classification system of the US Census. If we did not disaggregate MENA from white and instead grouped them as white according to the OMB classification, we see a totally different pattern. The MENA vulnerabilities artificially inflate the stress from income. So it looks like there was no difference between Blacks and whites. It also suggests that whites were more likely to have COVID symptoms than Blacks because we combined MENA with whites. And in this last one, although the percentage of those who said they knew someone who died from COVID increased substantially among the whites, they were still lower than Blacks. And that's primarily because the white population had such a lower percentage of those who said that they knew someone who died from COVID. So I present these analyses only to illustrate that disaggregating MENA from whites not only showcases MENA vulnerabilities, but it also makes other disparities, and in this case, Black-white disparities, more visible. And that's a really important point that recently has been brought up by a colleague of mine who's here at the University of Michigan, Dr. Jermaine Awad, who's in the psychology department. And these data bear that out quite clearly. But going back to our disaggregated analysis, what we were able to show is that whites were predicted to be 2.44 points higher than the MENA population in their cognitive health score. And that's when we controlled for age, gender, and education. In other words, whites were scoring much better on the cognitive health measures, which included digit span, forward and backward, animal fluency, and the CRAD word list. There was no difference between MENA and the Black population in our study. And then when we looked at racial and ethnic differences and the association between COVID-19 stress type and cognitive health, the results yielded a counterintuitive finding. And that is that greater stress, and that was the combination of income loss, death, and contracting COVID, actually predicted better cognitive health, but only for whites. So what does that signify? Now, I want to remind you back when I showed the COVID-19 stress levels, whites reported significantly less stress on all domains. So it could be, therefore, that just a little bit of stress is helpful for cognitive function, perhaps stimulating the brain, making one more vigilant. It also harkens back to the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is a model of the relationship between stress and task performance. It proposes that one reaches their peak level of performance with an intermediate level of stress or arousal. Too little or too much results in poor performance. I would also like to note that that MENA were similar to Blacks in that stress from COVID-19 did not affect cognitive health among the MENA population. So these findings remind us that though stress exposure may be equal, expressions may vary depending on outcome measured, and further, it may be that stress effects are not detected in the immediate situation. Stress exposure expressions may vary by race and ethnicity, and also may less often be detected using traditional measures, or may be expressed through other health behaviors and biology instead of psychological pathways. So these data were collected cross-sectionally in a very short time period. I think we still need to see what the long-term effects are to this stress from COVID-19. We do know that disaggregating MENA from the white category allowed for a more accurate assessment of disparities. And we did learn that stress predicted cognitive health only for whites and in a counterintuitive way, but illustrating once again that maybe a little stress enhances cognitive function. And again, this needs to be followed up with longitudinal data, which we hope to do in the future. Next, in thinking about practice, the area of social relations and psychological health are an important area to study in the field of aging. And I'd like to make one preliminary example here from some research that I conducted with my colleague. I don't know why this is happening. Sorry, it's asking for my password. With my colleague, Tony Antonucci, who's also developmental psychology faculty and research professor at ISR. And we did a project a few years ago where we disaggregated Arabs from whites and compared them also to Blacks in the Metro Detroit area. And what we did was we looked at social relations. And we also looked at depressive symptoms. And what we found is that when we disaggregated Arabs from whites, we saw a difference in contact frequency with regards to the people who are close and important to them in their network. And we saw a difference in the percent of their networks that are co-ethnic. Actually, MENA or Arabs differed significantly from both Blacks and whites. We did a descriptive analysis that controlled for age and gender in order to establish preliminary benchmarks. And what we found is that contact frequency was more frequent among the Arab population, implying that for Arab Americans, their networks may have a higher level of accessibility. But I'd also want to suggest that seeing your network more often also may suggest that it results also in a higher level of burden. So that's an area for further research, but just knowing that there's that difference is important. The most distinct difference was, of course, in composition. And that's the proportion of network members with the same race or ethnicity as the respondent. The MENA population reported a lower proportion of co-ethnic, signifying that they are not as segregated as whites or Blacks, which may indicate more integration into wider society. At the same time, it could also suggest that they lack the protective effect that co-ethnic ties seem to exert on health. Finally, Arab Americans reported the highest levels of depressive symptoms, significantly different from whites. And this is particularly important for the research that I'm focusing on currently with regards to cognitive function, because we know that depressive symptoms are a primary risk factor for developing Alzheimer's and related dementias. Okay, and now we're going to take a pause for a question. Okay, and the correct answer was contact frequency and percent co-ethnic. In terms of social relations, MENA reported more contact frequency than whites, but less percent co-ethnic in their social networks. Okay, you know, I just spent a little bit of time talking about social relations, and the recognition that social relations form and function may vary for the MENA community led to a desire to think about how to better meet the needs of families caring for someone living with dementia. So this initiative, which was funded by the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, was meant to advance knowledge and practice by breaking new ground that explicitly focused on family systems. So our goal was really to focus on the family as a unit of intervention instead of just a single caregiver. And the idea was to use Arab American families as the case study, which would simultaneously be a way to examine family systems, but also provide a means by which to bring resources to the Arab American community, which basically didn't have much in the way of culturally relevant programs and interventions. So we set out to adapt an existing Alzheimer's disease caregiver intervention, working with the Alzheimer's Association Greater Michigan chapter. We also worked with Access, and we engaged in cultural adaptation to enhance the comfort and acceptance of a program. And then we ended up evaluating it to see if it was effective. And I want to tell you a little bit about this work. Our cultural adaptation was done through focus group discussions. And we used the focus group discussions to modify program content, including the recruitment material, the PowerPoints that were used in the intervention, including creating videos that had representation of community members. We also translated the PowerPoint and the tip sheet and included vignettes that came right from the focus group discussions to make the material relatable. This is just a slide to tell you some information about the focus groups that we carried out and the analyses that were done. This gives you a little bit of information on the focus group participants. You can see we did 3 with family members and 1 with professionals. They were overwhelmingly female, those who participated. And the families who participated were almost 3/4 or more were immigrants. And their education levels varied. You can see that for the family that was, or the focus group that was carried out in Arabic, the education levels were quite a bit lower. And then you just have some idea on the hours of care that were being provided. So the themes that we discovered, these first three, burnout, respite, and challenging behaviors, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on this because these are universal issues related to Alzheimer's, but I put them up here just so that to illustrate the fact that there are universal issues. I mean, just because we're focusing on a cultural group doesn't necessarily mean that we are, not experiencing similar issues when it comes to Alzheimer's. So there are some similar issues being experienced. But what I want to focus on are the specific themes that emerged because of the cultural group that we were focusing on. And I'm going to illustrate just a couple of these with narrative data to give you a flavor of the themes. But 4 of them were prominent. The first was the role of national origin. This is important when it comes to caring, including the perception of how those who are not from the same origins approach care of a person with dementia. And I want to make this clear. It wasn't just whether or not one was MENA or not. It was within the MENA group, the fact that it's such a diverse ethnic group, and that being mindful of having people come around to speak the similar dialect, for example, or who have similar home country experiences was perceived to be really important when it came to caring for someone or finding someone to help you care for someone living with Alzheimer's. Family dynamics referred to the nature of the relationship with siblings and or adult children in taking care. Oops. I don't know what happened here. In taking care of somebody with dementia. Cultural ideals had to do with expectations associated with family roles and who would provide the care. And then we also had practical ideas, which were strategies to encourage families to attend the program. I mean, this was a big challenge that we had. Dementia has an enormous stigma in this community, and I know the stigma exists generally, but in an immigrant community, it has an added layer of challenge, given that the immigrant community is trying really hard to fit in and doesn't want to draw any attention to anything that may cause others to look down on them. So let me just give you an illustration of the family dynamics. Here you have Ida, who says about my brother, you know what my brother told me one time and he broke my heart, which we argue so much, me and him, about my parents. Me and him, we argue. If he let my father, I'm going to give you an example. He put his plate like this, and I say, no, khayyi, which is the Arabic word for brother. You have to put his plate here. And then she laughed. No, it's better here. No, it's better there. And then Natalie, one of the other participants, starts laughing and says, that's why you shouldn't have family helping you. Now, this data illustrates quite clearly the ideas of cooperation, conflict, and issues of control when it comes to taking care of a person with dementia. And what this kind of data did was directed us as we adapted our intervention on the need to build on strengths while at the same time convey the importance of letting go into the curriculum materials to explicitly address this, because this kind of sentiment came up over and over again in our discussions. In terms of practical ideas, here you have Sumayi saying, you see what's happening is you've got some people are religious, whether it's the mosque or the church. I'm not saying which religion, that they would listen like a caregiver thing. It would be an authority figure for them. And then Haitham said, but you're not saying using the authority, but they know nothing about it. In other words, what Haitham is saying, these religious leaders don't know anything about Alzheimer's. What are you talking about? And Sumayi is saying, no. And then Aisha chimes in. So Sumayi, you're saying like maybe at the prayer at the mosque, just to say, hey, there's a caregiver group about Alzheimer's. Some of your parishioners are going through this. Sumayi said, yeah, to create an awareness and at the same time provide them with information. They don't know it. Aisha said, yeah, no, it has to be done. Somebody's got to get the ball rolling. This exchange addresses involving religious institutions as a way to reach the community, as well as to educate religious leaders. This kind of data helped us to think about how to publicize the program and how to overcome stigma. So I'm just going to show you some example of adaptations. The first one here is the flyer promoting the program. There are a couple of adaptations we made. I want you to first notice on the left-hand side, it says living with Alzheimer's for middle stage caregivers. And what we said was living with Alzheimer's for Arab American families. One of the things that came up over and over again in our focus group discussions is when Arab Americans talked about caregivers, they were talking about people outside the family who they hired. When they talked about their caregiving experiences, they were talking about their role as a family member, whether it was they're a daughter or they're a spouse or they're a son or they're a daughter-in-law. So we wanted to make it relevant for families and not make them think it was for people who get paid to take care of individuals who have Alzheimer's. We also depicted a family as opposed to just two people. Here in the one on the left, you see the older man who ostensibly is the one with Alzheimer's, and then a younger gentleman who's caring for him. And what we wanted to do was to convey the family as a unit of focus, because when we carried out this intervention, we asked that at least one other family member join the initial person who signed up. And we also show a family who was at a wedding. This gentleman had Alzheimer's, and this is his daughter, his granddaughter, and his grandson. And they're at a wedding. And so this is showing them, even though he has Alzheimer's, they took him to a social outing. And it just showed, and by the way, weddings are like weekend community events in the MENA community. So it was culturally a very appropriate kind of scenario to show. And finally, we actually show a MENA family. We don't show, so that it's culturally congruent. So people can see themselves in the material and say, oh, okay, yes, this is for me, or it's meant for me. In the tip booklet, we also included vignettes. We adapted the tips by including vignettes that came directly from our focus group data. This conversation between Iman, Mariam, and Nuhad occurred in our focus group discussion among women from different families discussing their experiences caring for a family member with dementia. And this is just a way to illustrate the effective communication approaches, but using culturally relevant examples. Again, it's not that the strategies have to be different in terms of how you communicate with someone, but that you want to use them in a way where members of a cultural group can see themselves in it and relate to the material so that they can use it. And just to tell you a little bit about our intervention findings, I was really excited to see that the Zaret, we used the Zaret caregiving burden score, and you can see that the average before individual, I should tell you that. So when they came to the program, we asked them that they bring another member, and just simply asking them to bring another member gave them permission to tell someone to come with them. And that really went a long way in terms of ensuring that family members were on the same page when it came to the information that they were getting. Oftentimes in families, there's a lot of disagreement about how you should do things when you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's. So when you have more than one family member receive information, it allows them to be a little bit more stronger in their discussions with others about how things should happen when you're caregiving. But I want to just point out that on average, the mean was a little bit over 12. And after the program, it went down to 10.8. And that was statistically significant, even though I should have the sample size here. We had about 30 families participate, which was about 60 individuals. Family conflict was something we also measured because we were hoping that after they went through the program, there would be less conflict among family members. It went down slightly just at the trend level, but again, it was a small sample. And the point is it's going in the direction that we were hoping for. Members felt empowered. Their knowledge about Alzheimer's disease increased, and they felt that they were getting useful caregiving strategies. And then finally, caregiving satisfaction also increased. It went from about a 5.7 to a 6.1. Again, it's just a little increase, but nevertheless an increase. So they're all going in the right direction. And the reason why I think this is so important to show is because oftentimes MENA families will tell us, well, we don't need programs. We don't need any kind of help. We can handle it. We're a strong family and we take care of our own. But what this data does is show that actually, these programs can help you. And so you should take advantage of them because they can help in ways that are very significant. Okay, I'm going to stop here for another question. Okay, yay, yes, 92% got the right answer. Care burden decreased following participation in the caregiver intervention program. I do want to say that this program, once the funding was done, we were able to work with Access to make it a part of their portfolio where they answer it where they offer it on a regular basis, which is so exciting because before this program, there was nothing of the kind in the MENA community. We're still working though on attracting families. There's still a lot of, and I had this as a challenge here, and I know I'm skipping, but let me just talk about the challenge first. There's still a lot of stigma, and even though the program is being widely advertised, people don't feel comfortable coming out to the program in the way that we would imagine. We also know that we need to balance it between a virtual and in-person option. When we first offered this program, we thought we were going to do it in person, and then COVID hit. And so then we thought, okay, we'll just wait till it's over and we'll do it, we'll do it. And then, 1 month went by and 2 months went by and 3 months went by, and we realized, okay, it's not going away anytime soon. Let's try it virtually. And virtual seemed to work. Virtual options actually was one of the suggestions that our focus group participants said would be a viable way to get more than one family member to attend. And so, Access is currently offering this in both and giving it either in person or virtual based on the family's preferences. In terms of our successes, we really demonstrated that the approach that we took in terms of getting the words and the phrases and the ideals of the group was a very effective way to adapt an existing intervention so that that group could see themselves in the materials. And I want to make clear that our approach would likely work for any group where one is trying to be culturally sensitive. It's not unique to the Arab American case. Any group where you want to be culturally sensitive, you want to get into the mindset and the cultural environment or the cultural setting in which people find themselves. I mean, that's how you can reach people. I think we're also successful engaging with our community partners as equals. Access really took ownership of this program. We trained 6 of their employees to be trainers where they could actually offer this program in either English or Arabic. And we also wanted to, made the culture representation visible. That was visible not just in terms of the individuals who were used for publicizing the program, but we also made Arabic an option. And sometimes the program was given in Arabic, sometimes in English, sometimes it was a combination depending on who was there. Some people understood English better, some people Arabic better. And even for those who understood English better, throwing in Arabic words here and there sometimes just conveyed a kind of cultural familiarity. And, the Arabic language is very flowery and has a lot of emotional phrases in it and a lot of heartwarming phrases in it. So when they would throw in the Arabic phrases, it really made people feel comfortable and at ease. Okay. A final point that I want to highlight is that the study of Arab Americans can advance understanding of immigration on aging and health. And in particular here, I want to highlight the immigrant paradox. Studies that once documented consistent patterns of better health on arrival with declining health over time, otherwise known as the immigrant paradox or the healthy immigrant effect, now find much more varied health trajectories among U.S. immigrants when they are disaggregated by region of birth and arrival cohort. So it matters where immigrants are coming from, and it matters when they're coming. The MENA population is proving to be an important challenge to what was hypothesized to cut across all immigrant groups. In contrast to the immigrant health advantage that's been documented among other racial and ethnic groups, foreign-born Arab Americans appear less healthy than other foreign and US-born whites across a host of outcomes, including poorer functional health, worse self-rated health, and higher prevalence of chronic diseases, including obesity and heart disease. This is a paper that I carried out with a colleague at Duke University, Janan Reed, and we took the American Community Survey data and looked at foreign-born and native-born Arab Americans. Currently, the census data is the only way you can identify both immigrants and US-born. Many point to the evidence that it's an undercount of Arab Americans, but it's the best that we have right now. We looked at those age 45 and older. And what we did was when we controlled for the sociodemographics as well as education and poverty, I'm going to point your attention to Model 2. We saw that immigrants both reported more higher likelihood. They were 1.1 times more likely to report a physical disability and 1.5 times more likely to report a self-care disability or IADLs. So here we have evidence that the immigrant Arab American is doing worse than their US-born counterparts. When we then examined the extent to which there was variation among the foreign-born by immigrant arrival cohort, and what we found is that the later cohort, those who came in 2001 or later, actually reported higher odds of having both a physical and a self-care limitation. And in particular, it's the self-care limitations that seem to be prominent. And here you can see that the foreign-born were 1.63 times more likely to report, the foreign-born who came after 2001 were more likely to report a self-care limitation than the native-born. So, oh, okay. Sorry, there's a question. That is true. The answer is false. MENA immigrants report better health than the US born. That is false. They do not follow the path of the healthy immigrant paradox and indeed are a challenge to it. And what this data do is help us to see what it is about the suggest that we need to look at what it is about the immigrant situation that's influencing health. It's not just the act of immigration. We have to pay attention to what is the country like? What are they living in before they come? What is driving the immigration? What's the country like when they arrive? We know in 2001, after 2001, our country turned quite hostile toward individuals from the MENA region because of 9/11. And there's a lot of political instabilities in these regions. So we have to take into account a lot of different factors to really understand what is it about immigration that's influencing health, especially among older adults who are increasingly immigrating at older ages from the MENA region. So some concluding thoughts on Arab American MENA aging research and practice. Arab Americans are emerging as a distinct racial and ethnic group. As I mentioned early on in this presentation, the US Census is proposing to include a MENA category. And I also want to point out that we're living in a socio-historical period where Arab Americans are emerging not just as distinct and separate, but often perceived through a negative lens. And this has to do oftentimes with recent world events, including US foreign policy. And so their aging and care experiences are of paramount significance. I mean, I make reference to US foreign policy. You may all recall in the last administration, there was a ban on immigration that was called the Muslim ban. And although not all Muslims are Arabs, when people think Muslim, they equate it with being Arab. So that's just one example of how this negativity or this negative lens is prominent when it comes to this population. When it comes to health disparities, what I hope you got to see from today's presentation is that disaggregating Arab Americans from whites illuminates disparities, not just disparities between MENA and white, but it also helps to make more visible the disparities that exist between whites and other groups. And that's so important because if we don't recognize the severity of disparities, then it's hard to be able to address them. So the MENA disaggregation from whites benefits society as a whole, not just the MENA population. And I think that's an important point to remember. Also, with regards to health disparities, we can see that aging and health are not the same for all immigrants. And this is true for the case of the MENA population that doesn't fall in line with the immigrant paradox thinking. Finally, I just want to make a point about advancing research on families and care. A focus on the MENA population represents an important step towards advancing aging research and practice because it allows us to see the unique and universal elements of matters related to aging as a way to guide theory and practice. But it also helps us to see ways in which, for one population that may seem like it's unique just for them, but oftentimes issues that are universal are often accentuated in minoritized populations. And this helps us to address the challenges for everyone in society, not just that group. So Arab Americans are one case study that help us refine theory and guide practice by identifying both unique and universal elements. So that is it. I want to acknowledge my funding sources, including the National Institute of Aging, the Michigan Health Endowment Fund. I want to also acknowledge the partners who've helped make a lot of this research possible, including the Alzheimer's Association, the Greater Michigan Chapter, and Access, and of course, my colleagues who have played various roles in the analyses and conceptualizations of the topic that was presented today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kristine. We have a good group of questions. And so that being said, if you can limit your answers to pretty quick, sort of short answers.
Okay.
So number one, and this is just some clarifications about the earlier parts of your presentation. Can you explain to the audience, how do you measure cognitive health?
Yes, in the slide that I showed here, we measured cognitive health with 4 different indicators. One was the digit span backwards and forwards that comes from the MOCA. It was a telephone survey, so we were quite limited, but we wanted to get an array of different dimensions of cognitive function. So we did digit span forward and backward. We did animal fluency.
Well, as an example, if you don't mind, just give me what is the digit span for an audience that doesn't do this research?
Oh yeah. Okay, good question. So we would say to them, okay, I'm going to repeat to you 3 numbers, and I'd like you to, I'm going to say to you 3 numbers. I'd like you to repeat them to me. So the interviewer would say 2, 5, 8. Mm-hmm. And then ask them to repeat it. And then they would ask them to repeat another series backwards. Wow. So they would say, I'm going to say a series of numbers to you. I want you to repeat them to me backwards. So let's say I said 4, 7, 9. Then they would have to say 9, 7, 4.
Okay, thank you. Again, just an example for audiences not familiar with this type of research.
Yeah.
A second thing is, can you give us examples? You mentioned stress as an important variable. So like the types of stress, that you measure?
Yes, we measured, we measured a lot of stress, but the ones that I presented today had to do with whether or not the 65 plus respondent said they lost income because of COVID. Did they or anyone in their household have COVID? Did they know anyone who died from COVID?
Uh-huh.
Those were considered stressors. Yep.
So, how are Alzheimer's issues managed the same or differently here in the United States versus the countries of origin?
Among the MENA population?
Yes.
Well, one of the largest obstacles that we have in terms of managing Alzheimer's is that it's the Arabic word for dementia is actually a derogatory word that people use in everyday language to make fun of older adults. Mm-hmm. So that stigma is very real. And in the Middle Eastern countries where people speak Arabic, just being able to talk about it is a challenge. That carries over a little bit here in the US, and we've had to address that through our community engagement efforts, where we've talked about the importance of being able to talk about it. You know, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. You have to be able to talk about issues. So I think that's one of the biggest obstacles is the language that we use. And I think it's more accentuated in the Arabic speaking world just because the word for it in and of itself, even though it's the clinical term for it, people are offended when you use it because they think you're insulting them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one big issue. In terms of care, I would say that in the Arab world, the governments are quite weak when it comes to social programs. And family is basically the social security for all older adults. It's their only source of security. So I think the pressure on families is quite a bit more intense. Pressure on families in the US is intense too, but we have programs and resources available through government funding that we can access as a way to help us care for someone with Alzheimer's. So I would say just quickly those two things.
Okay. In terms of the MENA population, how does access to healthcare compare to other racial groups?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I myself have not done research in that area, and I'm not familiar of any research that has existed on that topic. I've heard mention of people say that healthcare access is a challenge because of language barriers for those who don't speak English. But I don't have any data on that, so it's hard for me to say.
Okay. There's one or two questions about, again, the earlier part of your talk, which is MENA as a racial group. So I'll repeat this question. So since we have determined that Arab Americans and other white Middle Eastern ethnicities, such as Kurds and Turks, are currently classified as white, can we refer to non-MENA whites as something like European ancestry whites or something?
Can you repeat the last part? Can we
Yes. Can we refer to non-MENA whites as something like European ancestry whites?
Oh. I don't see why not. I mean, basically, if you look on the census form, it says white is defined as those with European ancestry or from the Middle East or North Africa. So if you take MENA out of that, then that leaves European ancestry.
Mm-hmm. One thing I have seen, and this gets to this question, and actually I've seen this comment on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And so I will repeat the question, and it sort of gets at this issue of people in the MENA population of North Africa sort of separating themselves from Black Africans. So here's the question. I find it interesting that MENA seems to prefer to be characterized as white, suggesting a direct connection to Americanized Eurocentric privileges. The Middle East is a continent of Africa. Why not associate themselves with Black Americans who connect to the diaspora through African American characterization? And I know that's sort of a tough question.
Well, it's first, I want to make clear that the MENA population is actually trying to separate itself from the white group. But the reason why they are considered white has a long history. Early 1900s, when the MENA population started immigrating to the US, the only way you could become a citizen is if you were white. They weren't allowing non-whites citizenship. And MENA were initially actually, because they were coming from Lebanon and Syria, so that's not North Africa, it's West Asia. They were initially characterized as Asian. And if you were Asian back in the early 1900s, if you know your history, there was no way you were going to get citizenship. So the immigrants from Lebanon and Syria made a case for becoming white by linking their identity to Jesus Christ and Christianity, because the majority of Lebanese and Syrians who were coming over to the US were Christian. And the case that they made is that they're coming from the very land that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Palestine. And that is, where Christianity was born. So by linking themselves to the Christian faith, they actually were able to convince the courts to say that they were white. But now I just want to make clear It's sort of come full circle. 100 years later, they're saying, you know what? We are not white. We're not, many feel that they're not treated as white. Their experiences don't mirror whites. They shouldn't be labeled as white. And so they need to be disaggregated from the white category.
Thank you. And again, this is a tough issue that actually students in my class, I teach a contemporary cultures class, and we address this issue in my class. So here's a little bit about the immigration paradox. Health decline after immigration to USA. So since overall health among Americans is generally worse than the vast majority of developed countries, does the trend for health decline of immigrants simply mirror overall health for Americans?
You know, I'm not sure that that's the case, because actually the MENA immigrants have worse health than immigrants, and they are seemingly coming with worse health. And so I think a lot of that explanation has oftentimes been linked back to the countries of origin. I didn't get a chance to show this slide, but over the years, we've seen a decrease in immigrants from the MENA region that are coming from countries like Lebanon and Syria, which are our longtime immigrant communities. And we're seeing an uptick, enormous increase in immigrants coming from Iraq, for example. And Iraq has sustained a lot of political instabilities, a lot of war in the last 20 some years. And so we think a lot of the poor health outcomes, especially functional health, that are being detected in this research has a lot to do with just what their health status was before they come. So it's not really healthy immigrants who are necessarily coming, but perhaps those who have more health challenges. So I'm not sure that it reflects the general American health challenge, but it reflects a specific experience.
And that's really interesting, because research among Blacks who immigrate to the United States and who immigrate to Canada tend to fit the immigration paradox, in that they come and they have better health than native-born Blacks, but then over time their health deteriorates like the native population.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had the question. Oh, can you say a little bit more about the intervention program that you were discussing?
A little more about the intervention program. I'm so excited about that program. I'm not sure what they want me to say more about it. It's a program that the Alzheimer's Association has in place. And what we did was we took it and we adapted it so that it would reflect more of a focus on the Arab American experience. And the other thing that we did differently is that when we offered the program, we asked people to please bring someone else with them, that we'd really like you to bring someone else with them. And I'm just really amazed at the fact that everybody, without exception, had no problem bringing someone else with them. And I don't think they would have had we not asked them to. And what's significant about that is that I think when you're dealing with caring for someone with Alzheimer's, which some of you may or may not know is a progressive disease, there's no cure. It lasts anywhere from 4 to 20 years, which means the longer someone's living with it, the more challenging it is to care for them. Knowing the best way to care for someone with Alzheimer's is the only way that you're going to make sure that the person living with Alzheimer's has a good quality of life, and that you as the person caring for them has a good quality of life, because caring is very demanding, and you have to know how to take care of yourself so that you can better take care of the person with Alzheimer's. I don't know if that's what they wanted to know, but I'm happy to answer any specific question.
Yeah. So how important is it having an Arab-speaking caregiver in terms of receiving and accepting services?
Arabic speaking is only important if the person living with Alzheimer's doesn't speak English. I don't think that it matters if you have an Arab American who speaks English. But having someone from the same background can oftentimes ease the caring scenario when you're bringing in someone from the outside, because there's a cultural similarity that doesn't need to be explained, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Let me see if there's one other. So in terms of, this is, I guess, a more of a research question. When we looked at IADLs, could you just explain what that is? And was language a factor in terms of trying to complete the IADLs? But first, explain what IADLs are, and then
Instrumental activities of daily living. So they're things like being able to cook for yourself, being able to balance a checkbook, being able to dress yourself. It's sort of like the things that you need to carry out your daily activities. And it's different from activities of daily living, which is more like being able to walk long distances. Does language play a role in that? You know, the data that we collected was only among English speakers. So if people filled out the American Community Survey, they had to have known English. It wasn't translated into Arabic. So I don't think language played a role in that, I would say.
So, Kristine, it is now 4:15. So we're gonna conclude our presentation now. Again, I just want to thank you for a great presentation. I know I found it, you know, we've known each other for a lot of years now, and I found it extremely illuminating. I've learned a lot, and I just want to appreciate it. And I want to speak for, hopefully, based on the chat and other conversations, you know, that people also have really received this very well. So again, Kristine, thank you very much. For everybody here, remember we have another presentation by Peter Lichtenberg tomorrow on financial issues, in essence, financial scams, and how to help older population in dealing with financial scams. So thank you, everybody, and we will see, as they used to say, same time, same place tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Robert, again for the invitation, and it was a pleasure to be here. Really enjoyed the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm just going to add, you are all set for your continuing education hours as long as you stayed for the duration of the event and participated in the polls. You will receive an email from the continuing education office asking you to complete a survey, and their email is on the screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them. Thank you so much, everyone.